So ito, ano to? Naka-zoom? Naka-zoom yun.
Up. Diba? Yun yung kita
O dapat meron kayong naka-zoom.
ano po kasi, for backup.
Backup lang. Baka nangingialam. Hindi,
Okay lang po, sir.
hindi ako naka-inactive.
Actually, medyo naisip ko rin po sir na isang naka-zoom.
Oo, para may variation.
Dapat nga po yung
Kasi
kulang po
bawal
ng tripod.
Bawal.
Bawal kasi i-edit.
Ah, okay. Talaga? So as is yun siyang isasubmit.
Oo. Tapos, lalagyan namin sa YouTube.
Hindi po!
Ay, okay lang, sige.
Seryoso po, yun po yung sinabi sa amin.
Yeah, may YouTube channel ako. Sige, okay. So,
Tapos nilike po pala namin yung Facebook page.
Mamaya na ba-advertise?
ano yun? Oh, may page ako, pero iba pa yun sa account ko. May Facebook ako.
Pero hinanap ko po.
Mahirap akong hanapin. Kaya na nangyayari ko. Okay. Ikaw, dyan ka lang?
Nag-record na.
O, kanina pa.
Actually, kanina pa.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
So, how did you start your career as a journalist, and what were your experiences before your promotion as the research head?
Okay, in terms of career as a journalist, I can say that I unofficially started it when I was still young. To be exact, I was only 8 years old back then when I had my first ever published, not article, but it's a drawing meant for a youth or kiddie page of a major newspaper. That was Manila Times. So my artwork, a simple drawing of a beach, was published in the Sunday issue of the kiddie page back in 1990. And then from then on, I said to myself, I think I'll go into this career someday. So I worked my way from being part of the elementary school paper. I became editor-in-chief. Until high school, I was also the editor-in-chief of our student publication. Only in college, I wasn't able to join the student publication because I focused on my studies. But after college, when I graduated, I worked for Manila Bulletin. That was my first job when I obtained my degree. But I took broadcast communication. So I'm not really practicing what I've studied, but just the same, it's still in the media industry. So I first worked in Manila Bulletin back in 2003. I worked here for 4 years as a writer for the schools, colleges, and universities section. I was one of the pioneer staff writers of that section. And then I stayed here for 4 years. I left in 2007. And then I tried the magazine industry. I worked for Summit Media, Summit Publishing Company Incorporated, as a managing editor for special publications. So I dealt with special projects in collaboration with the company's advertising department. Then I tried working freelance, meaning I based my work on projects that come my way. Then I returned in 2012, February 2012, I returned to Manila Bulletin. This time I was designated as the head of research, which is 3 years into my second stay here. I'm still in that section, handling that section with 3 people under me. And then during those 3 years, I was also tasked to handle the environment news page of the newspaper. At the same time, I was also designated as a weekly night editor. So there was a time last year when I handled 3 concurrent positions, meaning I'm primarily the research head, while at the same time, I handle the environment news page. That's a weekly page. And also every week I render night duty as a night editor. And then now I'm back to being the research editor.
But it seems to be with what you've said that you're more interested in working for Manila Bulletin. Is that right?
Yeah, that's why I came back here because I tried the magazine industry. I saw that it's a different culture there, and my orientation really, while having worked for 4 years, is really for the newspaper industry. So since when I left in 2007, I I could say that somehow I was able to maintain a good record. So I think that was one factor why I was allowed to come back here. And then here I am now, going into my fourth year again. So if you will compute, all in all, I worked for Manila Bulletin for almost 8 years now. So I love the newspaper. I love newspaper. It's one of those tasks that seem effortless for me.
Okay, so the next question is, who do you look up to as a journalist, and how important is having a role model for you?
I can say I look up to our editor-in-chief, Mr. Chris Ikban. He's been with Manila Bulletin for 41 years, but prior to that, he has worked for several other newspapers. He was with Manila Times before, and I think he's a contemporary of the late Senator Ninoy Aquino, the father of our president, Benigno Aquino. They started at about the same time in their journalistic careers back in the 50s. And aside from that, he's an MA degree holder. So I can say that not only me, but most of our other journalists, our reporters, look up to our editor-in-chief. And if not within Bulletin, I can say that I look uh, I look up to the veterans in the industry as my role model in my journalistic career, and there are several of them. Well, I can mention Malu Mangahas. She's with the PCIJ now, but she used to work for the Manila Times. I look up to her because she's a very courageous journalist. She's published without fear a lot of really in-depth reports that I can say affected how the government implements its policies, stories that have helped people in one way or another, stories that made the public aware of what they need to know on what's going on in the surroundings, be it in politics, education, showbiz, or anything else that matter to the lives of Filipinos.
Okay, sir. The next question is, how committed are you as a journalist?
How committed? When you are a journalist, commitment is all about doing your job to inform the public. Whether or not it's a holiday, it's a weekend, it's there's a fire going on in your office, an earthquake struck, there's a typhoon outside, the wind is howling. You don't, they don't really matter to you as a journalist. If you know that your duty is to report what's happening to the public, then I think that's commitment. And I can say that I've experienced several of those. I've been here working in our office when Yolanda struck, when all people was advised to stay indoors inside their homes. I was here together with my people, and holidays, we're actually used to spending Christmas here in the office, but that don't matter to us. I think that shows the commitment of being a journalist. Not just a journalist, but being a media practitioner in general. Because being a journalist is not only in the newspaper, but there's also broadcast, there's TV, there's radio as well.
Okay, sir. So how do you gather stories that are interesting for Filipinos, and what kind of techniques or materials do you use when gathering news intended for publishing?
I'd like to share with you the one that we're focusing on right now. Uh, we have this in-depth story, not really investigative, but a more detailed kind of story covering anything under the sun that we have published every Sunday, and there's a corresponding video for it. That's why I told you earlier that we work together with our newly formed video team. So these stories are stories that uh, hit a chord among the public. Stories that they can relate to. Stories that hopefully will be able to help the readers, our readers. And how do we look for them? We monitor what's going on. Sometimes we base our stories, our upcoming stories, the ones that we're working on the big issues that's being reported now. And sometimes we look for stories ourselves, because not all the time the story is there for you to work on further. But as a journalist, it's one of those traits that you need to possess. Being resourceful, especially if you really like to help your readers. You look for stories that matter to them. You look for stories that may actually help them. So, being in the research section, I think that helps us a lot, because we use social media. We have Facebook right now, we have Twitter, we have Instagram. We talk to sources, and these sources give us tips on what stories we can do. And then we plan it out, we plan these stories out, we lay down what we need to do. Sometimes we make ocular inspections, we go to the area before we work on the story. But most of the time, we go straight to the place where the story comes from. And that's it. From there, whenever we're there, everything follows. We interview the people that should be interviewed. We get other sources aside from the primary subject. And after we've gathered everything, then we write. If ever we're still lacking in some details for our story, that's when we use our other resources here, available here. We have our library, and we can use the internet also. And we can also call other sources that we're not able to talk to for our story. So it's really a big task putting together a story, and it's a matter of resourcefulness. It's a matter of knowing the nature of the job, which is, we all know newspapers come out every day. There's deadline every day, but thankfully for our part, we are not required to submit or to turn in stories every day, meeting the particular deadline for reporters. So it's not applicable to us. But yeah, being into more in-depth stories, it's important that we really devote time to do these stories, so that when the time for it to be published comes, then we won't have any problem with the publication.
Okay, sir. So what is your opinion towards publishing bad news as more interesting for Filipinos than good news?
Well, let's face it. If it's bad news, people can really relate to these stories. Examples of bad news: accidents, disasters, deaths, anything negative that's happening around us. It may not look good, it may not sound good, or read good when you browse through the pages of the newspaper, but still, it's news. It's like the saying, bad publicity is still publicity. Still you're able to inform the public of what they need to know. But then again, as you mentioned, we have good news. I think from time to time we should also highlight this good news because uh, telling the public on something positive that's happening around them will also help them to get that vibe, that positive vibe, as they go on with their everyday lives. I think it's a matter of balance. There's for every good news, there can be a corresponding bad news. It's just not uh, focusing on the bad news or the good news. There should be balance for me, and that's responsible journalism. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you, Mama.
Thank you po.
Okay, so this is by segment.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Your cup. Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to my mansion.
It's a very nice place here.
Yes, thank you.
Very well, actually. Okay, so continuing the interview, the next question was question number 6 is, how do you handle pressure in dealing with deadlines as a journalist?
At least for me, it's a good thing that I have people under me. I introduce them to you. And we're not really bound by deadlines, as in the daily deadlines required of reporters. That because the deadline here in the news desk is 2 p.m. every day. Reporters should be able to submit their stories by that time. And since we're not really reporters, we're not out there in the field looking after stories every day, we're not required to meet that daily deadline. But it doesn't mean that we cannot be imposed deadlines. So whenever we have stories, especially the one that I mentioned earlier, the Sunday stories, so it's meant to be published on these stories are meant to be published on Sundays. So the deadline for that is Saturday noon. We make sure that we've already worked on it way before the expected deadline, like weeks before. For example, right now I am working on a story about survivors of Ondoy 6 years ago, and we're targeting to have it published on the last Sunday of the month, which is September 27, because that's the 6th anniversary of the tragedy of Ondoy. So as early as now, I'm already working on it. So by the time, or even before the deadline, which is the Saturday before September 27, and that's September 26, I won't have any problem with the editors. My story is ready.
So you're not stressed.
Yeah, not really so stressful. Unless they require us to write stories meant for tomorrow, and then they only ask us at this time, like 3 p.m. That's when pressure comes in. But we're used to it. It's a matter of practicing the style of writing of the newspaper and being able to get the details as fast as you can.
So it's about doing it ahead of time.
Yeah, doing it ahead of time, doing it fast while doing it accurate. Because you can do it fast, but you might give inaccurate details. It's a no-no in our work, in our industry.
So next question is, what problems do you encounter when gathering news scoops, and how do you deal with it?
I'm not really sure if that applies to us because you said scoop, right?
Yes.
News scoops are a thing of the reporters. I can't remember if we were able to get scoops before, but well, I can say that probably it's all about the source. Because if you know that you've stumbled upon a really interesting story, and you know that you're the only journalist uh, right then and there, when you realize that there's a story out of here, then it's your responsibility to do your job, write it, report it, have it published. And yeah, going back to what I said earlier, it's all about the source. If you know your sources, if you know who to talk to, then you won't have any problem, any trouble writing that scoop. Because when we say scoop, you're the only one with that story.
So next question is, really, what story are you most proud of covering since you've already worked here for 8 years?
Yeah. I'd like to say that our award-winning stories will be part of those stories that
Most proud of?
that we're most proud of, or I can say most memorable for us, for me.
It's like your greatest achievement.
Yeah, most of those stories are environment related. But there's this one particular story, which the copy of which I brought here, because I'd like to show you, that I can say I'm really proud of. This is a story about the crying lady. Her name is Rebecca Quijano. I'm not sure if you're already familiar with the story of Ninoy Aquino's assassination in 1983. But she was one of the prominent figures that emerged while the trial was going on back then. Okay, why crying lady? Because she's a self-confessed witness to that crime committed to the late senator, to the father of our president, Benigno Noynoy Aquino. And we did this story 2 years ago, in 2013, in the 30th anniversary of Ninoy's assassination. So, what makes this story something to be proud of? For one, I think this is an exclusive for us because we're the only one on that day, August 21, 2013, with this story, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. And another thing is the manner by which we were able to track down the whereabouts of this lady. We use Facebook. Facebook, YouTube. This is a collaborative story among me, Jamie, one of my staff, which I introduced to you earlier, and one of our on-the-job trainees back then. So we're 3 here in the byline. And we only had a week to be able to produce this story. And before we know it, it's already published. And somehow we got some good feedback from our superiors back then. Just that makes you proud of what you're doing. Having your superiors see that you're doing the right thing. So, the crying lady story.
Oh, that's very nice. So, actually, I'm sorry I skipped one question. So,
Sure.
how do you manage risks and threats when covering a story?
Risks and threats. So far, I haven't received any threats, like death threats or
For 8
the
years
like.
you have it?
Yeah, because I'm mostly in the feature side of writing.
So you
It's
don't-
just that now, when I was designated in the research section, that we get to deal with news. Risks, you need to be used to the job. Example, there's this recent story that we worked on for that Sunday story that I've been mentioning since we started the interview. It's an education-related story. We had to to go to a very remote area. It's a sitio in Antipolo City. where there's a small primary school with only one teacher um, for the last 5 years, handling every grade level, from kinder up to grade. Well, the students that who started with her 5 years ago are already in grade 4 now. So she's still handling them up to now. What's the challenge there? The CTO cannot be reached by vehicle. So we had to walk for 4 hours from the main highway in the city.
For
4 hours. We had to walk for 4 hours, cross 2 rivers before we can get there.
Were you
And back.
tired?
Yeah, it's very tiring, of course. But
Did you take any breaks or what?
we took breaks, of course. We rested for a few minutes for every, let's say, for every 2 kilometers that we walk going towards the school. Now, where are the risks there? The risks of not being able to come back to the city because it's a forest area. It's a very remote, it's a very far-flung area that you're practically disconnected to the world. Another risk is, what if it rained? Then we had to stay overnight in that place. And we need to report for work the following day. Another risk is, I can say health, because when we went there, we were in our very casual attires. I was wearing shorts that day, and there were mosquitoes, there were insects flying around while walking in the middle of the forest. Yeah, yeah. So those risks. So how do we handle them? Well, you need to be ready for those. How can you be ready? You cannot say. What's important is you know what your goal is when you go to a particular place for a story, and your goal is to be able to get the facts for that story and write that story when you come back.
So, last question. It's for aspiring journalists. So, if you would kindly look to the camera and give your advice to them.
Aspiring journalists
Yes,
like you.
Like us.
Okay. I believe that I'm one of those persons who cannot see myself doing other things than newspaper work. And what took me this long to be able to stay in the industry? Well, for one, you have to have passion. You have to love to write. You have to love writing, because if you're in the newspaper industry, at some point in your career there, you will need to write. So you practice writing. You practice the craft of writing. And in terms of getting really good stories, you have to be resourceful. You need to know your sources. You need to know where you can get information or details for your story. And third, I'll go back to one of the questions earlier about commitment. Journalism is about commitment. You cannot say that it's your day off. But what if on your day off there's a really big story and you're the only one who can do it? Let's say it's near your place. Will you make your day off an excuse? No. What's important? You're being able to rest or being able to inform the public. So commitment and responsibility, they go together. So as a journalist, if you want to become journalists, commitment and responsibility must be two of those traits that you need to possess. And lastly, you have to love your job. It's not all about the money. journalists in the Philippines are one of the lowest paid um, employees in any industry in general. And if you're after the salary, a high salary, and you want to be in the newspaper industry, then it depends on the company that you're working for, but don't expect that you'll be compensated high enough for the work that you're doing for the public. So if you love your job, everything else follows. That's it.
Thank you, sir. It's
You're
been
welcome.
helpful for having this interview with you.
You're welcome.